Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal when the devastating truth surfaced, that Sonny Corinthos had secretly orchestrated the abduction of Marco Rios as retribution against Jen Sidwell. Lucas's fury ignited into something primal and uncontrollable. For weeks, Lucas had dismissed the rumors circling around Marco's mysterious disappearance, believing that no one, not even Sonny with all his criminal history, would dare cross such a sacred boundary. But the moment he laid eyes on his younger brother, bound, gagged, and visibly traumatized in the dark, airless confines of a warehouse, something in Lucas snapped. The world as he knew it, with its fragile balance of alliances and grudging loyalties in Port Charles, shattered irreparably. Sonny had not just crossed a line, he had obliterated it, turning the moral ambiguity of their world into something grotesque. Lucas had once seen Sonny as a flawed protector of the Corinthos name, a man who operated in the gray to defend his family. But that illusion disintegrated instantly, replaced by the harrowing reality that Sonny had weaponized innocence in a blood feud. Sidwell, always the opportunist but now also a grieving father, recognized the crack in Lucas's composure and pressed into it with the calculated precision of a master manipulator. In hushed tones and with feigned empathy, he nurtured the bitterness blooming in Lucas's heart. He spoke not as a politician but as a parent whose child had been brutalized, carefully painting Sonny not merely as a rival, but as a barbarian whose actions had spit in the face of justice and humanity. Marco, he insisted, wasn't just collateral damage, he had been intentionally dehumanized, reduced to a bargaining chip in a war of influence and dominance. Lucas didn't need much convincing. Years of seeing Sonny's iron grip on Port Charles, of watching him dodge consequences while others paid the price, had already eroded his faith. Now, with Marco's anguish seared into his memory, Lucas made a fateful decision: he would not pursue justice, he would seek revenge. At first, his actions were tempered, filtered through the guise of outrage and emotional instability. He clashed verbally with Jason, challenged those who continued to support Sonny, and voiced his condemnation in public and private spaces. But that rage quickly morphed into cold calculation. Lucas, equipped with insider knowledge of both the medical system and local media channels, began constructing an invisible network of disruption. He discreetly reached out to old colleagues, leaked fragments of information that painted Sonny in an ever darker light, and used backdoor channels to orchestrate delays and chaos in Sonny's operations. What began as minor inconveniences soon escalated into systemic sabotage. Shipments disappeared or were rerouted. Safehouses were mysteriously exposed. Trusted allies vanished overnight. The pattern was too precise, too personal to be coincidence. And those who knew the truth whispered the same name in terrified tones: Lucas. Unbeknownst to Sonny, as he continued his high-stakes chess match with Sidwell over Proposition C and mounting public scrutiny, the real threat wasn't across the table, it was seated quietly behind him, sharpening the blade. At the church where emotions once ran high during Marco's absence, Sonny caught a glimpse of Lucas that should have haunted him. It wasn't a plea for mercy or a brother's concern. It was a glare of steel, emotionless, deliberate, deadly. When Sidwell rejected Sonny's offer for compromise later that day, Lucas said nothing. But in his silence was a message louder than any threat: the war had already begun, and he was no longer neutral. Days later, Marco was finally released, but he returned not as a hero, but as a shell of his former self. Gone was the vibrant man who once risked his life for Christina. In his place was someone haunted, broken, and painfully aware of the dark machinery at play in Port Charles. His suffering became a symbol, a chilling reminder of how power, when wielded without restraint, devours the innocent. Yet Marco's freedom was no resolution, it was merely the match that lit the fuse. What followed was a cascade of consequences, a relentless unraveling of Sonny's empire as Lucas, driven by grief and inflamed by Sidwell's manipulation, continued his quiet siege. It wasn't long before Sonny noticed the pattern: resources diminishing, loyalists fleeing, his carefully constructed world riddled with fractures. He paused his pursuit of Sidwell and turned his attention inward, suspecting something deeper was at play. When the pieces began to align, when he realized it was Lucas who had betrayed him, Sonny was stunned not by the act itself, but by how thoroughly he had underestimated the doctor's capacity for vengeance. Lucas had never been a soldier, but he had become a tactician. And worse, he knew Sonny's operations intimately, where to hit, who to bribe, when to remain silent. The betrayal was surgical. What made the situation more perilous was that Lucas didn't act for power, wealth, or influence. He wasn't trying to take over Sonny's world, he wanted to burn it down. And that made him unpredictable. He was a man whose moral compass had been shattered and whose pain had transformed into weaponized resolve. Sonny's usual strategies, bribery, intimidation, even reconciliation, held no sway over someone who no longer cared about consequences. In quiet moments, Sonny began to question the choices that had led to this. He had intended to punish Sidwell, to make a statement, but in doing so, he had created a new enemy, one he could neither buy off nor outgun. The war he had hoped to control was now spiraling into chaos, and the lines between friend and foe were blurring beyond recognition. Even Jason, torn between loyalty to Sonny and sympathy for Lucas, struggled to navigate the increasingly treacherous waters. And so, in the heart of Port Charles, where once alliances had held firm, a new Cold War was brewing, fueled not by ambition, but by anguish. Lucas had crossed a line, but he had done so with clarity, knowing that justice would never be enough. Marco's suffering had to mean something. And if that meant destroying Sonny's legacy piece by piece, Lucas was more than willing to pay the price. Because in his eyes, this wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure no one else suffered the way Marco did. Even if that meant sacrificing everything, including himself. Jason had always been a master of reading subtle shifts in people, detecting danger before it became visible to others. But what he saw in Lucas wasn't a shift. It was a transformation, a tectonic rupture that turned a once kind-hearted man into a weapon of precise and devastating consequence. At first, Jason struggled to name it. Grief, yes. Anger, of course. But there was something more sinister pulsing beneath Lucas's every move. It was the unmistakable signature of vengeance, deep, calculated, and cold. Lucas, the man who had once championed rationality in the chaos of Port Charles, had crossed an internal threshold, and Jason knew that once a man abandoned hope, logic, and compassion, he became something far more dangerous than any mob boss or politician. He became untouchable. Lucas had stopped speaking like himself. His words, when he chose to speak at all, were stripped of warmth. Gone was the gentle cadence that used to soothe patients in late-night hospital corridors. Gone was the curiosity, the measured tone of a man trying to understand and solve. Now, there was only brevity, finality, and stillness. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't seek approval. And that terrified Jason far more than shouting or threats ever could. Jason tried to reach him, more than once. At General Hospital, he pulled Lucas aside after a board meeting and looked into his eyes, searching for the doctor he had once known. But Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't deny anything. He merely offered a slight, unreadable smile and walked away. That silence spoke volumes. Lucas was done negotiating. Done justifying. He had already made peace with what he was about to do, and that meant there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, Jason began noticing a pattern, a slow erosion of Sonny's grip on the city. First, there were the subtle delays in pharmaceutical shipments connected to Sonny's charitable fronts. Then, high-profile community leaders who had once stood firmly behind Sonny's public campaigns began to withdraw, citing vague ethical concerns, or new business obligations. Confidential patient files tied to minor injuries at Sonny's warehouses were mysteriously leaked to the media, suggesting worker abuse and neglect. And the final blow came when two of Sonny's shell companies were flagged by the IRS following an anonymous tip. Ironically exposing a trail of financial activity that had been deliberately hidden for years. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. He was already inside. Jason knew the level of access required to make those hits possible. Only a small handful of people in Port Charles had the knowledge, credibility, and institutional trust to orchestrate such surgical chaos, and Lucas was one of them. But he was also the only one with a motive so personal, so visceral, that he would risk everything. Jason also understood that Lucas wasn't just acting alone, he was being guided, subtly and strategically, by Jen Sidwell, whose political savvy and thirst for retribution created the perfect crucible for Lucas's descent into shadow. It was the worst possible partnership. Sidwell supplied the vision, and Lucas supplied the means. Together, they were undermining Sonny's empire not with bullets or bombs, but with whispers, bureaucracy, and devastating precision. And yet, Lucas did not crave power. That's what made him terrifying. He didn't want to take Sonny's place. He wanted Sonny's world to implode, to rot from the inside out, until there was nothing left but ash. He didn't move to replace the system, he moved to expose it. Lucas understood the hidden arteries of Port Charles better than anyone. He knew which licenses were falsified, which donations had been laundered, which hospital programs were fronts for Corinthos investments. He dismantled the machine piece by piece. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet subversion that left Sonny's people confused and paralyzed. Sonny wasn't used to losing control. But Lucas was now pulling strings that Sonny didn't even know existed. Jason tried to warn Sonny again, this time more forcefully. But Sonny, still convinced that Lucas wouldn't go too far, dismissed the warning. "He's just hurt," Sonny had said. "He'll come around." But Jason knew better. Lucas wasn't coming around. He was circling like a predator, waiting for the next moment of weakness to strike harder. This wasn't the lashing out of a grieving brother. This was a sustained campaign with clear, escalating objectives. And the more Sonny ignored it, the more vulnerable he became. The most tragic element was that Lucas had once been Sonny's ally. Not in crime, but in trust. There had been birthdays, family dinners, hospital visits, shared confidences. Lucas had treated Sonny's children, mended Christina's injuries, and once defended Sonny's name at public hearings. That bond had once seemed unbreakable, but now, that history served only to sharpen the blade of betrayal. Lucas knew every intimate detail, every sensitive connection, and he exploited them all without hesitation. Jason began seeing the aftermath firsthand. Staff at the hospital hesitated to fill certain prescriptions. Grant money for the Stone Cates Foundation dried up. Regulatory board scheduled surprise inspections. Even the Port Charles Police Department, once informally deferential to Sonny's influence, began acting independently. Arrests were made. Files were reopened. Jason knew this wasn't coincidental. It was systemic. Someone had flipped the city's quiet tolerance of Sonny's rule into something resembling insurrection. And Lucas, calm and smiling and unbothered, was walking through the chaos untouched. Behind the scenes, Lucas's network continued to grow. He didn't need to recruit mercenaries or foot soldiers. He recruited disillusioned hospital administrators, underpaid journalists, whistleblowers, and civil servants. People who had long held quiet resentments against Sonny's reign of silent intimidation. Lucas gave them a voice, and with that, he gave them purpose. They didn't see him as a rebel. They saw him as a liberator. And that myth only grew with each successful strike against Sonny's empire. Jason now found himself at a crossroads unlike any he had faced before. He could move against Lucas, expose him, isolate him, neutralize him, but to do so would destroy whatever remaining thread of decency still connected the Corinthos family to the public. Worse, it would make Jason complicit in protecting a man who had kidnapped an innocent, who had started this war in the first place. But if Jason did nothing, Lucas would win, and Sonny, for all his power, would fall at the hands of someone no one had expected to turn. So Jason waited. He watched. He tried one last time to speak with Lucas, meeting him alone on the hospital rooftop one night. But Lucas simply looked at him and said nothing. The city below was alive with lights, but the man beside Jason had become a shadow, silent, sharp, and unmovable. In that moment, Jason finally understood. This war would not end in bloodshed, but in silence. Not with a final gunshot, but with the quiet unraveling of legacy. Sonny's fall would be clinical. Clean. And it would bear the fingerprints of a brother who once healed the broken, and now sought to break the unbreakable. In the shadows of Port Charles, where secrets are currency and loyalty is often a mask worn too long, the final illusions began to crumble. Slowly, inevitably, the facades fell away. Those meticulously constructed identities of ally, protector, brother, healer. What remained was a raw and unsettling truth, that in a world ruled by power and vengeance, even the most sacred bonds could be weaponized. Love could be twisted. Trust could be manipulated. And the very people once sworn to protect each other could become the architects of each other's destruction. Port Charles, a city built on the fragile foundation of families, alliances, and whispered forgiveness, now stood on the brink of tearing itself apart, not by foreign threats or criminal empires, but by its own blood. Sonny Corinthos, long considered the immovable pillar of both fear and respect in the city, now found himself besieged from all sides. But the most dangerous adversary wasn't Jen Sidwell, with his cold political ambition and public war over Proposition C. It wasn't even the faceless agencies circling like vultures around Sonny's crumbling enterprises. It was Lucas, the man who had once healed his wounded, dined at his table, and shared in the joys and agonies of family. Now, Lucas stood as the quiet storm brewing beneath every failed shipment, every leaked document, every shuttered front. His revenge was methodical, not explosive. And that made it terrifying. Sonny had built his kingdom on the principles of dominance, loyalty, and calculated intimidation. He survived cartel wars, federal investigations, betrayals, and personal losses that would have broken lesser men. But he had never prepared for a war like this, a war waged not in the streets but in the corridors of institutions, in boardrooms, in the operating rooms of hospitals and editorial offices of newspapers. Lucas knew Sonny's weaknesses because he had once been part of the systems Sonny used to maintain control. He knew which strings to cut, which walls to collapse, which hands to shake in public and poison in private. And Lucas was no longer tethered by morality. He had chosen the darkest possible path, the path of deliberate and patient vengeance. He didn't lash out blindly, he planned. He struck when no one expected it. He understood that Sonny's greatest strength, his ironclad control over people's fear and silence, could also be his greatest liability. Because when fear turned to disgust, when silence turned to exposure, the empire began to rot from within. Jason watched helplessly as Sonny's once unshakable web unraveled, strand by strand. And though he knew the origin of this new war, even he could not predict how far Lucas was willing to go. The man they now feared was not driven by money, nor by political ambition. He wanted something far more dangerous, vindication through destruction. He didn't want to stand over Sonny's ruin to claim it. He wanted to bury it and walk away, without ever looking back. The citizens of Port Charles began to feel the tremors. Long-standing loyalties cracked. Families argued over who had crossed the line first, Sonny, with his brutal abduction of Marco, or Lucas, with his systematic dismantling of the Corinthos legacy. The community that had once rallied behind the illusion of unity now divided under the weight of mistrust. Old alliances broke. New ones formed in secrecy. And behind every curtain, someone watched, waited, and wondered, how had it come to this? And then came the question that no one could ignore any longer, who would survive this? This wasn't just a clash of egos or ideology. This was a civil war rooted in love turned to hate, in grief twisted into retribution. With each passing day, the line between justice and vengeance blurred until neither side could remember which they had set out to achieve. Christina watched her family fall apart, torn between love for her father and the horror of what he had done. Michael, long hardened by his own betrayals, began to question if Sonny's war with Sidwell was even the real battle anymore. Carly, ever the defender of Sonny's image, now faced truths she could no longer deny. Truths that fractured her allegiance with every new revelation. And Drew, quietly monitoring from the shadows, saw the city returning to a state of chaos not seen since the darkest days of mob rule. Lucas, for all his coldness, was not immune to the toll. But he embraced the pain. He carried it like armor, letting it fuel each strategic move. He had made peace with the cost. Because in his eyes, the pain Marco had endured, the trauma that had left his brother trembling in silence, deserved retribution that no courtroom or apology could ever deliver. Lucas had sacrificed everything he once was for the chance to ensure Sonny felt what he now believed, that some acts are too monstrous to be forgiven. And Sonny, once the king of this complex kingdom, stood isolated. Every move he made was met with resistance. Every message intercepted. Every deal tainted. He could no longer tell which of his allies were still loyal or which had been turned. He began to see ghosts in every shadow, people he once trusted now keeping their distance, eyes avoiding his, voices dulled by doubt. And in the few quiet moments left to him, Sonny began to realize a bitter truth: he might not survive this, not in the way that mattered. In Port Charles, the streets felt different now. Quieter. Not the calm before a storm, but the silence of something already broken. The war between Sonny and Sidwell had become a smokescreen. The real reckoning was happening in whispers, in secrets traded behind closed doors, in the actions of a man with nothing left to lose. Lucas had become the unthinkable, a former friend, a family insider, now the enemy most capable of dismantling everything Sonny had ever built. And so, as the city held its breath, watching the last flames of loyalty flicker in the wind, one question remained. Would anyone survive the war born not from power, but from love turned into vengeance? Or would Port Charles bleed once again, this time from wounds inflicted by the very hands that once vowed to protect it?